Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. The forces of imperialism momentarily on the march, momentarily on the offensive, and this is a simultaneous three-pronged attempt to overthrow the status, the governments, to subvert and break up and otherwise loot, sack, and appropriate Ukraine, Venezuela, and Syria. And it's important that this three-pronged thrust be defeated. And for people who are concerned about their moral compass, we'll get to this later in the program, you better adjust your moral compass to make it clear that if Ukraine, Venezuela, and Syria, all three go down, then the entire relation of forces in the world is going to be modified in a tragic and very ominous way that might not be the last word for the fate of civilization in our time, but it would be a staggering blow. And we need to develop a morality of results, not of pious intentions or a morality of posturing, rather a Machiavellian morality, certainly. Machiavelli's morality depends on public virtues and a morality of results. Now, the problem we also face, perhaps most urgently, the ruling elite of the United States is collectively insane. And we see this in the various windows that have been opened up into the behavior of these creatures by whoever is taping their phone calls, whatever Russian or other agency is doing the world a service in this regard. When we hear Nuland and other imperialist operatives, the way they talk, the way they think, we are dealing with a profoundly degenerate form of political life. The U.S. elite, centered in Wall Street, based on derivatives, devoted to primitive accumulation against the world economy, increasingly parasitical as the productive activity in the United States has declined, industrial production de-emphasized, agricultural production is certainly important, but taking up fewer and fewer of the population, and especially by proportion. All of this leads to a mentality of pure parasitical speculative rentier in places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, but really all over. It's not just an Eastern phenomenon. You can find it in Houston and Dallas and Austin and Fort Worth just as much, and so on down the line. This insane U.S. elite has got to be fought, and that's also important for your moral compass. So we've just had a signal event this week, largely ignored. The hysteria could hardly have been thicker. When the Russian Federation, in the midst of a significant international crisis, decides that the time has come to shoot off an intercontinental ballistic missile, I believe of the Topol type, that ought to get your attention. That should somehow factor in to the way you think you see the world, because if the other guy sees it as the time of the ICBMs, not just of the Kalashnikovs and the tanks and the naval vessels and the armored personnel carriers and so forth, but of an intercontinental ballistic missile, that should really get your attention. Now, that is what has happened this week, and was scarcely a blip. You'd normally think that the Anglo-Americans would go wild, right, that they'd make that the issue, the neocons especially. But I think there's a desire not to awaken the stupefied American public, right, rather to give them more marijuana, for sure, so they're even more stupefied than they are. That's the Soros recipe. And even Jerry Brown has enough realism to say that those potheads out there have attention spans which are not adequate for self-government, right? They're simply under democratic conditions. You can't have that. And at a certain point, the narcotics culture will render self-government and the current form of government absolutely impossible. We may be closer to that than we think. But we've got to look at the fact that I have been talking, especially since last June at the Left Forum in New York City, about a mass strike wave worldwide. Well, now you see the CIA and their cohorts, their associates, have figured that one out. And their idea is, of course, that if there's going to be a mass strike wave, there's really no stopping the mass strike wave. But what you can do is take it over for yourself. You can pervert it. You can hijack it. You can turn it against existing forms, and you can promote forms that are qualitatively inferior but have the benefit of riding the wave of new novelty in the strike wave. So that's especially, I think, what you see in Ukraine. Remember, a lot of the energies being released in these situations come from mass unemployment, despair, deflation, the typical artifacts of a world economic depression. And remember that three-phase process that I try to warn against: depression, dictatorship, world war. And you can see that in Ukraine, right? From depression now to the dictatorship, the absolutely lawless mob rule of the fascists, Turchinov and Yatsenyuk and Yarosh, of course, and Chanibok and the rest of these people, and then world war. It's absolutely critical to break into that process, put an end to the depression. But now, unfortunately, it's gone so far that we've got to try to propose here, in the framework of this depression, what might be done to cool off Ukraine. And I'll talk about this at various points in the broadcast. But the answer is, quite frankly, Finlandization. Finlandization. There's a country, the northern edge, where Europe and Russia come together, or Europe and other countries meet with European countries meet with Russia. This is Finland, right up in Scandinavia and the area of the Baltic, and for quite a few decades, from 1944, I guess, for 3 or 4 decades, Finland was subject to Finlandization. Finlandization is not new. It is similar to what Denmark did in the face of the German Empire after losing the Danish War of 1866 and having its main defenses stripped away by Bismarck. It meant that Denmark had to go into a kind of posture of peaceful coexistence and decidedly non-provocation of the German Empire for many, many decades. But then it became the question of Finland. You got to remember that the situation that gave rise to Finlandization was a very specific one. Field Marshal Mannerheim, the Finnish leader, had fought a war against the USSR, the famous Winter War of 1939 to 1940, holding up the Red Army for quite a while and inflicting heavy losses, but eventually succumbed. And then, when Hitler invaded the USSR in June of 1941, Mannerheim and Finland joined in with the hope of getting back the Karelian isthmus, I guess, or peninsula, which is on the border between Finland and the USSR, was at the time. So that made Finland essentially a direct ally of Nazi Germany against the Soviets. At the end of that, though, they worked out an arrangement that allowed Finland to be perfectly independent, to keep its social order and so forth, but also to satisfy the international security needs of the USSR, Finlandization. We'll describe just a couple of the aspects of that in a minute when we come back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net. The updates this week are even more numerous than usual. A couple of radio broadcasts, Richard Syrett and his program on Zoomer Radio Toronto. That was Sunday evening. You can hear that. And then the Rents program this past Wednesday evening. All of that at Tarpley.net and a lot more. The rents program was where I advanced. I've mentioned it, I think, perhaps on this program the previous week, but certainly in some detail on the rents program this past Wednesday. And there I talk about Finlandization. Some guy who wanted to give me a hard time wrote to me saying, Henry Kissinger says, and I'll give you the quote, Kissinger has said, Kissinger has said that, I'll read it to you, wise Ukrainian leaders would then opt for a policy of reconciliation between the various parts of their country. Internationally, they should pursue a posture comparable to that of Finland. But this, of course, is the Washington Post of Thursday, March 6th. So that's quite a few days after I had begun to develop this. And what I mean by Finlandization, I think, is more far-reaching than what Kissinger says. But fine, gold is where you find it. I'm so glad that Kissinger has advanced to the position of wisdom occupied previously by me. So here's the idea. Finlandization, what does it mean? First of all, you get to keep your internal order. You get to keep your economic system. All these choices are purely up to you. What you need to do, though, is declare neutrality. Neutrality. It means you won't join NATO. And even Kissinger, I'm happy on that point, too. Kissinger's second point in this essay, Washington Post, Thursday, March 6th, he says Ukraine should not join NATO, a position he says he took 7 years ago. That's wonderful. They should not join NATO. And indeed, it was absolute folly to have Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria. None of these places should be in NATO. What American wants to fight or die for any of the above? Damn few at this point. Any government that tries to make good on such a pledge is likely to be toppled here at home. So, Finlandization. Internal order, your business. But international neutrality. So, neutrality means you don't join the Warsaw Pact, it's not there anymore, and you don't join NATO, and you don't join anything else, right? You don't join anything. You probably need to have some kind of a cooperation treaty. These used to be called friendship treaties. Maybe that's no longer a good term, but just a treaty framework that details cooperation. The basic idea is that you want to avoid provocations. You want to avoid having political parties that are anti-Russian in this case, or pushing any other kind of ethnic vendetta or racism or anti-Semitism or anything of the sort. And at that point, you have essentially solved the problem. But, of course, in order to get to such a Finlandization, neutrality, renunciation of international military alliances, and some kind of a cooperation treaty, you would have to get rid of precisely people like Jarosz and his right-wing sector, his fascist group there, and you'd have to get rid of the Svoboda group of Chanibok, who figures in all of the scholarly materials on European fascism of the last decade. So that's the problem. But that could be done. The way you would want to get rid of such people, of course, is through an economic development program. Remember, how can a demagogue of the wretched caliber of Chanibok or somebody like Jarosz, how can they gain traction? Well, it's because of the prevalence of despair, unemployment, lack of perspective, and so forth in the society. So you'd need a development program. Fortunately, this is exactly where Ukraine would come into its own. You want to go from Berlin to Kiev and then on to Southeast Europe and into Asia. This is all a perfect role for Ukraine. In other words, east-west infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and trade infrastructure, and so forth, power lines and the other things. This would mean then the revival of the Ukrainian economy, which of course has suffered under the current system. Remember, the way in which the Soviet Union broke up, right, the 16 Union republics back in 1991, was that the nomenclatura, the oligarchy in each one of those places, it started, of course, with Yeltsin playing the Russian nationalist card, and then the rest of them did it, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, and Lukashenko, or his predecessor in White Russia, Belarus, and then in Ukraine. Similarly, this was done by oligarchical elites, the nomenclatura, who decided that since the communist ideology, Marxism-Leninism, had collapsed, that they would maintain their power by playing the card of nationalism. And this has not worked well. So you'd want to get beyond this. So, Finlandization, neutrality, and an economic development program, and certainly not economic blockade, economic warfare. Don't think that the answer is the extravagant expense of having fracking done in North America and then liquefying that and shipping that over as natural gas. This is absolutely insane. So let's have the Finlandization of Ukraine and avoid conflicts in the future. In other words, freeze this, right? And I would say to the people in NATO, you want to have a cordon sanitaire, you want to have a belt of countries between Russia and Western Europe, right? You've got them. You've got the Baltics. You've got Belarus. You've got Ukraine, and that should be plenty. Now, if you don't do this, what are you going to get? I've called attention in the past to Natalia Vitrenko and the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, and she is now going around Western Europe and calling attention to what's actually happening. She's accompanied by Sergei Marchenko. These are people that I know. I've met them. I've had them here in my home. I certainly respect them very much. And what Marchenko points to is that there are 18 nuclear plants functioning in Ukraine, 18 nuclear plants. And those could become something very dangerous. In other words, that is another way you can get to World War III, not just the clash of nuclear forces, but these nuclear plants. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Trade Radio. The answer is the Finlandization of Ukraine, neutrality, no NATO membership, a cooperation treaty with Russia, and the avoidance in the way that Finland was able to do, avoiding the development of fascist or provocateur political parties, precisely of the Pravi sector, that is the right sector, or Svoboda, or the Udar of Klitschko. Let's not forget him. He'd still like to be president. That Russian ICBM, again, reminds us that there are these, I believe, 18 nuclear plants there, which could be very, very dangerous. And the other thing that Marchenko has talked about in his press conferences with Natalia Vitrenko, that this coup d'etat, the fascist coup d'etat of the 22nd of February, that is now 2 weeks ago? Yeah. The fascist coup of the 22nd of February by the right sector and Svoboda essentially leading the charge. This has created now instability in this entire area. Remember, this part of Europe is the area of greatest ethnic admixture. It's where the nationalities are all mixed up. And that's a possible cause of friction. It could be a wonderful source of variety and exchange of ideas. But the way it's going now, more like an exchange of bullets. So that is an area of grave instability. Now, according to Marchenko, there are people in Romania in positions of power who are saying that a slice of the southwest Ukraine belongs to them. This is the famous area, Bessarabia, right? The area between the Dniester and the Prut, Pruth. Between those two rivers, there's a strip of territory, and they want that for Romania. And in Turkey, there are people who are saying, wait a minute, the Crimea was once the Khanate of the Crimea. In other words, it was a Mongol Khan ruling over the Crimea, and there are people in Turkey who say, well, by rights, we're the caliphate, or we were the caliphate, and therefore that should come to us. Why don't we put an end to these sorts of atavisms, right? These are rebirths of very old-fashioned political thinking. Now, just checking the text of what Marchenko says, it's 15, not 18, 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine, but that's already enough. And remember that this character in the right sector, right, Tarasenko, says that he wants to get nuclear weapons for Ukraine, and the Svoboda party of Chanibok, they also, this is now more official, in their party program, they want to have nuclear weapons as well. So do you want fascist goons, hooligans, anti-Semites, racists, thugs with nuclear weapons? Is that what we're paying for? The problem is that seems to be what the Obama policy is pursuing. We'll talk about this now in just a second. But notice also internationally, Kerry. To get back to reality, right? Kerry, of course, one of the worst specimens of this insanity in the elites. The U.S. forces in Afghanistan are in a very tenuous position, right? Karzai is angry. Karzai's interview to the Washington Post this week, he's not happy. The U.S. has been killing his people. He's fed up. He's obviously got political reasons to say what he's saying. Suppose the U.S. forces have to leave Afghanistan in a big hurry. You know, there's the story in the 19th century of the British Army that went into Afghanistan, and just one of them came out, right? He was allowed to come out to tell the story. That's the way the legend goes, at any rate. And in this case, if the U.S. forces have to leave Afghanistan in a big hurry, would it be a Dunkirk retreat, leaving all that valuable equipment to fall into the hands of whom? The Taliban? Or who? I don't know. Who might come in and grab it? If you don't want to do that, there's only one way. You can't get it out in useful time on trucks through the Khyber Pass and then all the way down to Karachi. Can't be done. It's got to go north, and what you eventually get to is it's got to get very quickly into the Russian railway system. If Russia denies its railway system, that U.S. Army is high and dry. The soldiers might get out with their shirts and their backpacks, maybe, but not much more. No howitzers, no tanks, no electronics, no other equipment, a huge loss. And that depends on cooperating with Russia. So guess what, gang? It's time to cool it on this Ukrainian stuff. Now, concerning Kerry and Obama and their arguments. Well, the U.S. is offering $1 billion of export guarantees. From the Ukrainian point of view, that's chicken feed, right? Remember that Yatsenyuk wants 35 to 37 billion euros. I've lost count. But from the U.S. point of view, $1 billion could work wonders in WIC, in Head Start. How about $1 billion could essentially roll back this year's genocidal cuts in the food stamp budget, right? The SNAP program. So how dare you, Obama? By the way, this is Obama cutting his own throat. How are you going to run in November as a party that has maybe created a new war front, and at the same time you're cutting food stamps? This is a recipe for political suicide. And then Barroso, coming from that right-wing area of Portuguese politics that's otherwise identified with Salazar fascism, this Barroso has somehow come up with 11 billion euros for Ukraine. And if I were in Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Cyprus, and many other places, I would say, what the hell? No way, Jose. In this case, it's Jose Barroso, so it fits. No way, Jose. No penny, not €1 centime for these Ukrainian fascists. Obama's economic sanctions, how about them? At the same time that he's giving $1 billion to the fascist clique in Kiev, he says he's going to put economic sanctions on anti-fascists. If you're opposing the activities of Yatsenyuk, if you're fighting back against the coup in Kiev, the coup of February 22nd, then the U.S. is going to sanction you and your family and no visas and steal your assets and whatever it is. So this is now quite insane. Right? Again, U.S. elite gone insane. Obama and Kerry cite the Ukrainian Constitution. Right? We've now got the question of March 16th. That's a week from this coming Sunday. March 16th, I believe a Sunday, will be the referendum in Ukraine, but only in Crimea, on do you want to be in Ukraine with more autonomy or do you want to join the Russian Federation? And right now it looks like the Russian Federation part is going to win. How are you going to argue against that? Obama and Kerry say, well, that's illegal. The Ukraine Constitution says it's illegal. That's also the Yatsenyuk argument. Sorry, boys. The Ukrainian Constitution is a dead letter. It has no significance because you tore it up on the 22nd of February. Not only did you tear up the Ukrainian Constitution, you also tore up the deal brokered by Fabius, by Sikorsky, and by Steinmeier that the opposition forces were supposed to disarm their followers in the square and clear the public buildings and clear the public square. And you didn't do that, did you, Yarosh and company? So forget about the Ukrainian Constitution. It's a goner. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. I'm thinking of a remark about 23 years ago from my late friend, Professor Taras Vasilyevich Muranivsky, who was a Ukrainian. He was part of the Novi Mir group in Russia in the 50s and 60s when that was a kind of reforming movement around that literary magazine, Novi Mir. Taras Vasilyevich Muranivsky, in a speech here in the United States in the mid-90s, made the remark, look, the U.S. wants to treat Russia like a banana republic, but don't forget it's a nuclear banana. And that nuclear banana, I think, ought to have been called to mind by this ICBM launch, together with the Zapad maneuvers, right, the biggest ones in many years, and then a special air defense drill, the activities of the Russian Navy in the Sea of Azov, the Kerch Strait, the Black Sea, and so forth. All of this should point to the fact that this is regarded by Russia as an existential question. Another good maxim here is that the U.S. has the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says that extra-regional powers should butt out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. Well, that could find some kind of an application. If the U.S. can do that to the whole Western Hemisphere, then certainly Russia ought to be able to say, look, extra-regional powers should butt out of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet territories, right, the so-called glacis, what the U.S. and the West regard as the cordon sanitaire, the Russians regard as the glacis. So fine, let them have a functioning glacis and make these provisions that I mentioned under the heading of Finlandization for the internal management of these countries, and they'd come out much better. Look at Finland. They made a lot of progress at the beginning of the period of Finlandization. Finland was way behind Sweden, and within a couple of decades, they had essentially gotten about equal with Sweden, or at least roughly comparable, right? No longer a hopeless inferiority of Finland. So that has much to be said for it. Watch out for the banana. And this constant talk, the prattling about the Ukrainian constitution is, of course, a bad joke. Obama's argument is that the government in Kiev is legitimate. How can it be legitimate? There was a coup. Oh, well, Yanukovych left his post. He fled his post. Oh, does that mean that the next time Obama goes to Hawaii on a vacation, it's okay to have a coup in Washington? What kind of talk is that? So Putin is certainly correct. This guy is damaged goods, Yanukovych, but that is the legitimate president of Ukraine, for whatever that's worth. And certainly the legitimacy cannot revert to somebody like Turchinov or Yatsenyuk. That's out of the question. So after the fascist coup of the 22nd of February, Ukrainian constitution is in limbo. Then there's the issue of secession. Well, we're told, and this is now, let me quote Obama directly on this from the Washington Post of this morning, Friday, March 7th. Obama says, "The world is well beyond the days when borders can be redrawn over the heads of Democratic leaders." And I don't know what he has been, let's not even speculate. Who knows what this means to Obama? He's crazy. Let us take a look at a little place called Kosovo. Kosovo, a part of Serbia. But in February 2008, under the auspices of the Mad Dog Bush and Cheney administration, Kosovo separated from Serbia. It became a separate entity, right? Kosovo is now its own thing, is as of February 2008. And that was done with full, formal, pseudo-legal machinery. How can the U.S. then turn around and say, well, in February 2008, secessionism was fine, but we're now well beyond the days when the borders could be changed? I guess he's got a quibble about Democratic leaders, but again, how can you call the creatures of the mob, right? The creatures of the mob, Turchinov and Yatsenyuk, how can you call them Democratic leaders? Well, of course, you can't. When the Kosovo secession took place, and you can look at this, look at the Wikipedia article. It's very illuminating. There are some people who said, this is sui generis, right? This is in a class by itself. It creates no precedent for any place else. Others said, oh, it creates a precedent, and it's a good precedent. And others who said, it creates a precedent, and it's a very bad precedent. It's going to lead to the breakup of countries. Well, anyway, it's a precedent for sure. And Russia warned at the time that this would be applied in ways that the wonderful human rights activists, and this is Samantha Power, is essentially one of the founding mothers of this independent Kosovo, which is a criminal state, right? This is a criminal enterprise under the guise of an independent territory, right? You can ask Italian NATO generals; they will tell you this. So there is no possible argument by the U.S. I would also, as you know, I don't like secessionism in any form, and secessionism is almost never the cure. But in this case, look, let's try to distinguish. My distinguo would be this. You look at a territory like Alsace-Lorraine. It was French up until 1870. Then it became German until 1919. French again, 1919 to 1940. German until 1945, and then French again. It goes back and forth. I mentioned Finland and Karelia. Karelia was part of, this is now Western Karelia, Finland up until 1940, then goes to the USSR in 40 to 41, back to Finland from 41 to 43 or 44, and then back to the USSR. And you see that these border areas tend to go back and forth, right? And we mentioned this Bessarabia. This is also an area that has gone back and forth. Let's just look at this for a second. back in the early 90s, I had a chance to hear Prokhanov. Prokhanov was the editor then of Dень, The Day, which was a right-wing populist, anti-Western Russian newspaper, and as such, it had all kinds of interesting things in it. It then was banned at a certain point when Yeltsin shot up the parliament. As a good Democrat, would send tanks to shoot up the parliament. It then became Zavtra, and I think it's still going. Prokhanov pointed out Russia has traditionally had pulsating borders. Pulsating borders. You can look at the map. You can do a time lapse, and you'll see that these areas go back and forth, very large areas. Poland, at the end of World War II, Poland moved about 150 kilometers to the west, right, and similar things. And Ukraine is very much an area where this pulsating has gone back and forth. Up until 1914, most of the Ukraine, certainly all of Poland, was under the Russian Empire. From 1918 to 1920, thereabouts, there is this phase where it's very unsettled. The German armies advance. You have the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, and I think under the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, most of Ukraine was going to be put under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Germany's ally, including Kiev. But that didn't last. And then when Germany fell apart in 1918 in November, and Austria-Hungary in the previous month, we then had a period where Ukraine was fought over by three armies, and we'll get to that in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Just this question of the pulsating borders of Russia, right? They're driven forward, driven back in the middle of World War I, and at the end of it, Brest-Litovsk pushed the Russians way back to the east. They were then able to recover some of that, but Poland at that point remained very large compared to what it had been. It had been, of course, partitioned among the three empires. And similarly, in World War II, the Wehrmacht pushed Russia all the way back to Stalingrad and the gates of Moscow and so forth, but then that was reversed with the fortunes of war. Specifically, the immediate post-World War I area is interesting because you have the Bolshevik Red Army under Trotsky, you have a White Army backed by the Entente, by Britain and France, under Denikin, a typical White Army monarchist leader, and then you've got this anarchist, the so-called Black Army of Nestor Makhno, in my book, a madman, the guy whose motto was, "My task is to destroy, it's up to you guys to rebuild after the fact," right? And this Makhno's program was essentially autogestion, right? Everything was little units that would be self-managed. It kind of reminds us of the autogestion school of, I guess, Richard Wolff at the New School here, or I'm sorry, at the University of Massachusetts, emeritized. So the Red Army versus the White Army versus the Black Army goes back and forth a lot. You get various hetmen or atamans coming forward, and then once the front stabilized, Kiev is on the Russian Soviet side, and this other town that's good to look at, Lvov. Let me just spend a minute on this. The emotional center of gravity for the fascist group in Kiev is actually this place called Lvov. Now, Lvov is the Russian, Lvov. In Polish, it's Lvov, but Lwow. In Ukrainian, it's Lviv, Lviv. In German, it's Lemberg. In Italian, it's Leopoli, Leopolis. So this place is the center, right? When Stefan Bandera, the idol of this group, in the square, right? The goons, the proto-fascists and so forth. When Bandera declared his Ukrainian entity, he did this not in Kiev but in Lemberg, Lvov, and that's the sort of emotional center of gravity for them. And there are other figures that come forward in this time, but the Bandera one I think is the most important. And remember what he did. He led an SS division brigade against the Red Army and then took refuge in Munich in the Radio Free Europe apparatus and reputedly then started a policy of targeted assassinations to create the idea that there was guerrilla warfare in Ukraine. And again, I can't help remembering that quote, the famous quote from Churchill, "I was not prepared to make a great squawk over Lemberg." That's in his debates with Stalin, and then at Yalta, right? Where would the border be? What would happen with Poland, and so forth? So that's this area, right? It's a fought-over area. It's an area where the borders go back and forth, and you haven't had stability for many, many centuries. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Barbarossa, then the other way, then the Red Army, and so on and so on. And then, of course, in 1991, the pulsation goes all the way back to the east. And now it's maybe creeping west a little bit. So not worth a war, not worth one GI, not worth one dime. The United States has no interest. Kerry, come to your senses, butt out, or your Skull and Bones headquarters may soon be a smoking ruin, along with much else. Couple of other things. The so-called Greek Catholic Church of Ukraine has played, I'm afraid, a negative role in this. Now, this is a result of the Unia of Brest. Back in the late 1500s, the Jesuits promoted, in effect, a split-off of religious groupings. Some of them had been Orthodox, and they were brought towards the Vatican. And these are the so-called Uniates, and their big headquarters is, once again, Lviv. And these people are, unfortunately, mixed up with the Yarosh and Chanibok group. And I would call on the Vatican, Pope Francis cannot want this to go on. The Vatican must intervene, right? The Secretariat of State and so forth, the various other congregations in the Vatican need to get busy, get on the job, and start reining in these chaplains to these awful groups, right? Now, this, just to some background on that, there's always been friction. There was this guy, Cardinal Sleepy, and Cardinal Sleepy, I have visited the headquarters of the Ukrainian Uniates there in Rome. Cardinal Sleepy was their guy. They wanted him made Patriarch of the Ukraine starting under Paul VI. And Paul VI said, no, I'm not going to make you Patriarch of anything. And so far they have not gotten, as far as I know, a Patriarch out of Rome. So there is friction. There's some difference of opinion. Good. That needs to be resolved in favor of discipline from Rome over these guys, because they're now becoming an embarrassment. And they're threatening what have been very good relations between the Vatican and the Kremlin. Not worth it over these characters. So that's one. Now, the other one is the mythology of these characters depends on this notion of the great famine, right? The Holodomor. The Holodomor, death by hunger, I guess, is allegedly the deliberate starvation, the deliberate famine and genocide by Stalin and the Soviets against the Ukrainian population in 1932-1933. And I would refer you to the paper by Annie Lacroix, that's Lacroix-RIZ, Annie, A-N-N-I-E, Annie Lacroix, Professor of Contemporary History, University of Paris 7. And she has a number of papers about this. And this, he says, this is an invention of the European anti-communists. And it goes like this. If you go back, as she has, and look at the correspondence of the various embassies in Moscow, in Warsaw, in similar places, and this includes Germany, Poland, Vatican, you will see that, for example, the French diplomatic reporting says there is a shortage of food, in the disette shortage, and that is 1933 to 1934. It is the fascist embassies, the German and Italian ones, working for Hitler and Mussolini, respectively. They say une famine, a famine. Whatever disette means could be translated as famine, but it's clear famine is much stronger than disette. So the idea then is that it's the German and Italian propaganda, fascist propaganda, that starts up with this famine. Unfortunately, the Vatican seems to have gone along with it, and that was then the point where it becomes overwhelming. Is William Randolph Hearst then comes in, and he starts the agitation about Stalin starving the Ukrainians, and that's where it took off. And this is now the most durable, the most long-lasting myth of what went on in the Soviet Union, and it is the creed of these characters in the Yarosh and Chanibok organizations. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Now, a couple of more things about Ukraine. It's a complicated topic. Took more time than I'd hoped to budget for it. But we got these insane U.S. elites. At the same time, let's just look at the internal dynamics of this Kiev fascist clique. What are the various appointments with the chaos and collapse that they have? They are now committed with Yatsenyuk to IMF austerity. That will mean removing totally the subsidy on the price of natural gas for cooking and heating. Very bad idea. That will blow the place up, whether it's this winter, which goes on. Remember, I was once in Moscow. It snowed on May 1st. So you figure there's still plenty of winter left out there in Eastern Europe. IMF austerity will mean a social explosion, and that will be directed against this government. So Yatsenyuk says, we are on a kamikaze mission. It's going to be very harsh. It's going to be painful. So that's number one. The second one is in terms of the personalities. When it comes to the presidency, sometime later, not in May, but sometime after that, Klitschko, the Palooka, has come up empty. He didn't get anything in this government. Nobody from the Udar Punch Party has gotten into the cabinet. I wonder if there's a Judy party to go with the Punch Party. But Klitschko was iced out, and Timoshenko took over everything with Turchinov and Yatsenyuk being her stooges. So there's obviously a big problem, because remember, Klitschko has somewhat more traction with the mob than Timoshenko does, right? She's barely tolerated because she's, of course, a kleptocrat who ran the country for 6 or 7 years. And then there's this. Remember that Yarosh and company, as well as Chanibok, that means Right Sector and Svoboda, are raving anti-Semites. And NPR tried to put on a rabbi this week saying, oh, no, there's no such problem. This is ridiculous. You should listen to the appeal coming from the top Chabad Lubavitcher rabbi of Ukraine saying it's very dangerous. That was in Haaretz in Israel. NPR tries to paper this over, but it won't be papered over. Yarosh and Chanibok raving anti-Semites. Yatsenyuk is actually Jewish, according to some accounts. So what's that going to be? This also allows us to judge better, I think, when Yatsenyuk came out there at a certain point. He said, if it takes a bullet in the head, I'll take a bullet in the head. And later on, when he appeared, somebody started yelling bullet in the head at him. Those might simply be people who are against him, not because he's an IMF agent, but because he's Jewish. So this is a terrible situation. Now, given all that, we have this insane U.S. elite. What could be the salvation of the world? It turns out, and this is important for people to understand, the interests of the future of civilization coincide and will coincide for a significant time with Putin's program of restoring Russian dignity and, to some extent, Russian power, certainly. The Russian view of this, of what's happening in Crimea, is under the heading of the ingathering of the Russian lands. In other words, that last pulsation in 1991-92 pulsated too far. The pendulum swung too far in the anti-Russian direction, and I think that's probably legitimate. And certainly, from the point of view of the United States and Europe, it is important that Russia be strong. Unfortunately, this situation of U.S. world supremacy from 1991 on until now, this has brought out the worst in the United States. It has created these horrendous figures that we see, the Kerrys, the Susan Rices, the Samantha Powers, the Newlands, and so on down the line, right? These imperialist monsters, radical subjectivists, raving ideologues, right? Collective insanity in the elite. The only remedy of this is a power center in the world which is sufficiently strong and self-confident and has the will and the intention to counterbalance the United States to some significant degree in world affairs. We don't need World War III, certainly, but we need to get back to a situation of at least rough equivalence, rough balance, and I mean approximate balance. Nothing rough needs to go on. Otherwise, I don't see how you contain the insanity of the U.S. elite. I don't see what force on earth could counterbalance this. And the dangers are obviously quite real. So remember, when the Soviet Union was strong, real wages in the United States were much higher. And this was because the U.S. elite, evil bankers though they were, finance oligarchs, predators, and what have you, they had some sense that there was a point beyond which they could not go in looting and degrading the U.S. population, because they realized that there would come a point where people would say, look, I'm so fed up with Wall Street domination, let's see what these other guys have to offer. That point can be reached in any country. And today it could be reached even more easily than in the past. The question for Russia, what is missing from the Russian approach, I would say, is an attractive economic model. Putin has said to the oligarchs, look, you guys keep out of politics and I'll tolerate your existence, right? If you cross the line like Khodorkovsky, to jail you go. If you try to organize a coup, you're going to be jailed. But otherwise, oligarchs can go on, right? And that would include also other oligarchs, right? The ones that fled to London, but then continued their subversion. What would be necessary is a dirigist, protectionist, mercantilist model with a strong state sector and a strong role for state initiatives in Russia. And that, I'm afraid, has not come sufficiently to the fore. We had Kudrin as finance minister for quite a while, until a couple of years ago. He was the last prominent figure of the Yeltsin era who held on. And that's exactly the opposite of what it should have been. It should have been the economic transformation very early on. But in any case, you've got to wish Russia well in all of these regards because of the need to counterbalance and contain the insane U.S. elite who otherwise will proceed to run wild over the world and willy-nilly cause World War III. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. A good word that might be applied to the right sector and Svoboda parties in Kiev is revanchism. Revanchism was the Soviet propaganda term for Bonn, right, for West Germany, for Adenauer and his successors in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s. And in those days, it meant German forces who wanted revenge, la revanche, for their defeat in World War II, and they were therefore revanchists, looking for revenge against the Soviets who had humiliated them. I think today it is revanchism on the part of Chanibok and Yarosh and the rest of these creatures. And let's never forget our friend Muzichko, the goon who fought alongside the Chechen terrorists and who tells you how many tanks and APCs he destroyed. These revanchists obviously cannot be supported, but the entire U.S. foreign policy is built either on the killers, the death squads of Syria, or the revanchists, the neo-fascists of the Ukrainian regime. Now, in the middle of all this, we have the crisis at RT, formerly Russia Today, which I think indicates a number of things. First of all, Abby Martin this past Monday said that the Russian actions in regard to Crimea and Ukraine are wrong and that she was fiercely independent and she had her own moral compass. She then got a support statement from Sam Sachs, who works as a commentator there. And then 1 day or 2 days later, Liz Wall, one of the news readers or anchor women, quit on the air. Abby Martin didn't quit. She says that she's going to stay on at Russia Today, that she was invited to go to Ukraine, to Crimea especially, on a fact-finding tour, but declined to do so, which I find problematical. She said, I am not an expert on Crimea or Ukraine. I don't really know much about this, but I'll tell you that it was wrong. Not a strong position. She then got herself onto Piers Morgan. I think she might have gotten onto Anderson Cooper. The Fox network was happy about this. The Fox and Friends in the morning were gloating. Sam Sachs, I don't know what he's going to do. Liz Wall says that she comes from a family of Hungarian refugees, having come over to the West in 1956. So far, Tom Hartman, surprisingly, does not seem to have advanced any critique of what Russia has done. Maybe he's following Dennis Kucinich, because Kucinich focuses on the illegitimacy of the Western position. And Max Kaiser, I don't know what he's doing. But you can see what this problem is. I would say to these people, especially Abby Martin, you talk about your moral compass. Your moral compass cannot simply be to oppose military intervention everywhere and in all forms, because that would then have left you in the 1930s and 40s in the position of an appeaser of fascism. Now, that you didn't do that, but I'm saying hypothetically, if you had been around then, that is where it would have left you. And it cannot be excluded today, given what you see in Kiev, that we're not entering a new fascist era where resistance against such fascism is going to become essential. And you can't determine in advance what forms this will take. I would also argue RT has limited airtime. Remember, it's a world in which all the corporate media, from CNN to NBC, ABC, CBS, NPR, PBS, on and on, all agree that, for example, Russia attacked Georgia. It's absolutely crazy. Georgia attacked Russia in 2008. And they all agree that the group in Kiev is legit and the detaching of Crimea is illegit. Russia Today has limited airtime. I think it is morally questionable to use that airtime to come forward with your own radical subjectivist moral compass based on precious little understanding of what's going on. The broader problem, of course, is this. Russia today, in recent years, it's really not Russia today. You could call it Ron Paul today, or Assange today, or Snowden today. And this is very problematic, just a couple of cases, right? Ron Paul, this week, used his appearance on Russia Today to argue in favor of secessionism. He said secessionism is the way out of all this. He's a neo-Confederate, right? That makes him a racist. That puts him in the same league as somebody like Marine Le Pen in Europe, or these other, racist or xenophobic groups. And somehow Russia Today they have one policy for the xenophobes and racists of Europe, except for Farage, right? Continental Europe, it has to be. But in the Anglo-American world, it's great to be that. Putin, I think, correctly pointed out, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. It didn't have to happen. It would have been perfectly reasonable to detach the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, let them go their ways, let certain people in the Caucasus, Georgia, if they want to leave, some others, Azerbaijan, depends on the case by case. But certainly the 5 republics of Central Asia would have been happy to stay with Russia. The Belarus and Ukraine could easily have stayed in the USSR, and if somebody like Nazarbayev had become the new president, that would have underlined that this was no longer a Russian creation. That would have been within reach, and that's what should have been done. And then we wouldn't have this pendulum swinging so far in this anti-Russian direction. So that's Ron Paul, right? The root of this problem is secessionism, and he wants to say more secessionism is the answer. Assange, they gave him a program. What did he use it for? Remember when he got on there with Nasrallah and he tried to convince Nasrallah of Hezbollah that he should stop supporting Assad and take up the Western position? I'm shocked. And then Snowden, well, this week we've seen Snowden's scribe, right? Snowden's publicity man and public relations director, Glenn Greenwald, according to Pando, interesting website, of course, now working for Omidyar and his website, right? Greenwald, now the $50 million man, thanks to Omidyar. And it turns out that Omidyar has kicked in money along with USAID to support the destabilization and subversion of Ukraine. In other words, the pro-democracy groups in the square. So look where that leads you. The problem is Russia Today must stop tailing after the latest provocation. Right? Ron Paul is he's a deployment against the United States. It's not worth it. And then Assange, of course, this is the limited hangout to get the Arab Spring going. In the case of Snowden, one thinks in retrospect that the conflict between the United States and Russia has been certainly exacerbated by the presence of Snowden, right? If he hadn't been there might have been somewhat less acrimony. And the other thing is we have this very interesting analysis coming from Wayne Madsen that Snowden is actually working for the CIA in order to stop the National Security Agency from sucking up all the CIA secrets. The CIA wants to shut them down so the CIA can continue in relative obscurity. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So it's a great mistake to have Russia Today putting people on the air and indeed idolizing and lionizing them when they're people who hate Russia, because the kinds of characters you're going to get with Ron Paul and Assange and Snowden are the ones who are going to turn around and stab you in the back in the first crisis. And that's what has happened. So it's better to be somewhat more discriminating. Certainly it's important to report on resistance movements inside the United States and to play up things that otherwise wouldn't be played up. But what's the sense of tailing after Snowden and Assange when they have the corporate establishment media on their side to begin with. What is gained? Not that much. Now, Greenwald has just launched his joint venture, well, funded by Omidyar, right? We're told $50 million. Greenwald, Jeremy Scahill, and Laura Poitras have now got something called the, what's it called? It's something attempting to make it sound like it's inside dope, right? The Intercept, is that what it is? I guess so. The Intercept. So this thing is now under a cloud because it's revealed that the Moneybags is somebody who supports these destabilization activities of USAID, meaning the U.S. intelligence community. And therefore, we must advance grave doubts and suspicions as to whether this new website might not eventually turn out to be yet another means of cognitive infiltration, since that is the general framework in which these characters arrive on the scene. So, again, Abby Martin, get your moral compass fixed, because it is malfunctioning. Your north is not true north. Now, in terms of the overall problem, the other thing that's going on, the question of world supremacy, we've been through this a couple of times. It's always worth reminding ourselves we're living in a time which is atypical, and up until 1991 it was not like this, and I think soon it won't be anymore. This idea of the unipolar world, the single superpower, what the earlier ages would have called universal monarchy, right? Universal monarchy with no significant worldwide challenge. This is abnormal, and it's better for all that this not be the case. Better for the U.S. population. As I said, when the Soviet Union was a credible counterweight to the U.S., real wages in the U.S. were much higher, union conditions much better, various rights, ironically, were in better shape then than now. What are the previous examples? Well, Spain obviously had a period of world domination, and we can mark this from the turning point of the Italian Wars, right? The Italian Wars at the end of the 1400s and beginning of the 1500s. The Battle of Pavia in 1525, with the capture of King Francis I of France by the Spanish, François Ier captured. That was a pretty humiliating defeat for France. That launches the Spanish supremacy in Italy, which is codified in the Peace of Bologna, and that goes all the way, well, we might say, some would say, until the Battle of Rocroi, R-O-C-R-O-I, 1643, at virtually the end of the 30 Years' War. Others would say into the 1650s, that the late 1650s mark the point where world supremacy is transferred from the Spanish world empire into the hands of Louis XIV and France. And this is thanks to the efforts of Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Mazarin. And it's also important, and this is one of my areas of research, that in the final phase of Spain, you go from the leadership of Lerma to Olivares, Osuna, and these people. It's kind of like neocons in some ways. But anyway, the Spanish world supremacy from about 1525 until the late 1650s. Then what's with the French? Well, from either Rocroi, 1643, or the late 1650s, however you want to count it, to the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713. That's the French phase, and this is when William of Orange is able to assemble his coalition of England and the Netherlands and others in the War of the Spanish Succession, and it's an aggressive war against France, right? As Jonathan Swift points out at the time, the conduct of the Allies, the English and their friends, British by now, this is very bad, right? They're the aggressors. So the French supremacy just lasts for a couple of decades. The British supremacy, we can date it from Utrecht, 1713, to Dunkirk, 1940, I suppose. You can then count in a phase of German supremacy, which doesn't really last, right, from 1940 to 1943 or 44. But pretty soon, probably about 1943 worldwide, it's the United States that takes this up. Although the U.S. supremacy is counterbalanced and contested up until 1991 by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But the problem is now, since 1991, the U.S. world supremacy has been very poorly managed. This could have become a long-lasting phenomenon if a golden age had emerged, an era of peace, progress, prosperity, rising levels of rising standards of living, worldwide full employment, economic development going on everywhere, the pacification of these old quarrels. That has not been done. Sorry, the U.S. has blown it. This is a terrible commentary on what could have been done. This has not been done, but we are now looking at a period after about 25 years, which I guess is about what you could expect given this quality, this terrible lack of quality in the ruling class. After 25 years, maybe 30 years, the U.S. supremacy now coming to an end. And again, that's good. That should not worry anybody. It can mean reindustrialization. It can mean a normalization. And I think that's what the American people mean when they say, we don't have a national interest at stake in Ukraine. It's true. You do not. You do not have such a national interest, anything but your interest is in good relations with Russia and China and others, and what's going on in Ukraine simply gets in the way of that. Now, unfortunately, not enough time to do justice to domestic affairs, but let's just remember this. The Obama budget, as promised, has dropped the chained consumer price index, and that's worth celebrating. The chained CPI has disappeared. That is no longer mentioned, but according to certain commentators, Obama still reserves the right to sell you out at some later point. He's just removed it from the visible counter, right? He's now got it under the counter, and he's willing to deal with the Republicans at some point, right? If Obama, when the moment when Obama becomes a lame duck in late 2016 will be a time to watch out, because that's exactly when he might sell you out in order to, as he sees it, increase his legacy. And with the fact that the Trans-Pacific Partnership seems to have gotten bogged down, that is a good thing. In terms of the propensity of the United States population to fight back, you see the Texas primaries this past week. Notice Kesha Rogers, LaRouche candidate, coming in second in the Democratic primary for the United States Senate from the state of Texas. Now, if a person weighted down by the tremendous baggage of LaRouche and his personality cult and all the acrimony that goes with this can still come in second in the Democratic primary with a platform of impeaching Obama, with all those handicaps, I think it shows that a reasonable candidate, not burdened with personality cults and other fetishes, could have won the day. So I think that ought to encourage people. You can't win it if you're not in it. You got to come forward, run for office, and realize that Rogers result is a barometer of how hungry the American people are for an alternative. And we'll be back next week here on World Crisis Radio. Keep in touch with Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net.